Just like to point out on this slide down at the bottom that all of the slides are available, a PDF of them, at bit.ly/SMPTEDC-7-30, today's date. So again, bit.ly/SMPTEDC-7-30. So if I go fast and you miss something on a slide, don't worry, you can get it later. So I'm going to do my history a little unusually. I'm going to work backwards, starting with the future. So maybe this is something that's coming, a polysensual cerebral communicator, where we'll get vision and sound and maybe taste and smell and tactile stuff all directly into our brains. Now, is this ridiculous? Well, there was a SMPTE webinar in 2017 that talked about an MIT hat that could directly stimulate the visual cortex. And here's things that have been around for 10 years or so already. This is an exhibit of the Korean Etri at IBC in 2010. We have virtual reality, UHD, high dynamic range, wide color gamut, high frame rate. We can reconstruct sound waves. There are haptic and tactile things. There are olfactory and palatal things. This was something where they showed an image of, remember the Tanya Harding issue where she whacked another skater, or supposedly did. Well, they had a little leg whapper built into this chair so that you could feel that. But let's get to something more practical. When did HDTV start? Well, if we look at Broadcasting Magazine, it said, the exposition's opening on April 30th marked the advent of this country's first regular schedule of high-definition broadcasts. So which exposition are they talking about? Was it maybe NAB in 1996? No, it was a little earlier than that. It was the New York World's Fair in 1939. But I said high definition, and yes, they talked about high definition television. It was 441 lines total, or what we would call today 383i. Now, some people think that television in general started at the New York World's Fair at the RCA Pavilion. That's because RCA had a very, very good marketing team. If we even take the World's Fair as the start, then RCA bringing it to light omits Crosley, GE, General Motors, and even Westinghouse at the same fair, all showing television. But here's a listing of television programs in London in 1937. And so that means that it couldn't have started in 1939. And we can go back even a little farther. This is the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, and there's what they called a television canon. And we can go back farther than that, and here is a report of the Television Committee to the British Parliament, and it's about high-definition television, and they say it should not be less than 240 lines. And we can go back farther than that, and here is television news in 1931, and they're talking about a baseball game being televised in Tokyo in 1931. And we can go back a little bit farther than that, and here's an ad for a television demonstration in a newspaper in 1930. Here's a story about it in Popular Mechanics magazine called The First Television Show. But we can go back even a little farther, and this is that same television station, WGY, and they started doing a regular schedule of television newscasts in 1928. And 1928 was quite a year for television. Here was a demonstration of higher definition television at the Berlin radio show, and this was the beginning of hyping of resolution. They say, oh, how can you possibly live with 30 scanning lines? You need at least 96 scanning lines. But in fact, 30 scanning lines looked better than what they were showing. There's an actual off-screen photo of 30 scanning line television. In 1928, we could also record television. Now, not very well, but you can sort of tell that there's a person there. It did improve very quickly. So here's a recording from maybe 1932, and you can see that one a lot better. And it might have been better when it was live, too. This is a reconstruction much later. In 1928, there was television in Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US. In conventional stuff, there were regularly scheduled newscasts and remote TV coverage and dramatic programming and so on, and even color. And then special stuff, there was 3D TV, there was see-in-the-dark TV, that's one of the see-in-the-dark cameras on the right there, and there was two-way TV. But we can go back even farther. Here's 1927, and there's Philo T. Farnsworth, and he achieved all-electronic scan television in 1927. It was just a dollar sign, but hey, that was a start. It's reported that he had an earlier diagram, but we can go back farther than that. So this, by the way, is still 1927. That's Ernst Alexanderson at GE, and he was using speed and phase controls to watch mechanical TV at the time. And here is a demonstration of large screen TV at Bell Labs in New York City with Herbert Ives. And as you all know, there's that beautiful looking demonstration screen at the right, and this is what was going on behind it. So more what engineers are accustomed to seeing, perhaps. But we can go back even farther than that. Here's 1926, when John Logie Baird did a public demonstration of TV with recognizable faces, which he first achieved in 1925. You can see all of those light bulbs there. The person that he hired to sit in front of the camera was afraid that his hair was going to catch fire, and so he went away and he couldn't see any picture. But he then paid him more, and he sat in place. But we can go back farther than that, and here's a patent that was filed on a scanned all-electronic television system in 1923. And in the same year, a little earlier in the year, here's the founder of SMPTE, Charles Francis Jenkins, who successfully demonstrated motion pictures over the air. So that's television, isn't it? Well, it was silhouettes. And it turns out that there's a good reason for silhouettes and a bad reason for silhouettes. A good reason for silhouettes is if you don't have sufficient camera sensitivity, so you expose what you're shooting in front of a very bright light. The bad reason for silhouettes is if you think you don't have enough bandwidth, but sharp black-white transitions require more bandwidth than grayscale. But Jenkins's engineer said that he would splash outside the assigned bandwidth if he transmitted grayscale, so he transmitted silhouettes, and Baird got the win. But we can go back farther than that. Here's a patent that was applied for in Russia in 1922 for a videotape recorder. And there were two problems with videotape recorders in 1922. One was there was no such thing as video, and the other was there was no such thing as tape. We can go back a little farther than that. Here is the front page of the San Bernardino Daily Sun on October 7th, 1919. And look at the very top of the page. They say, hey, you can watch the World Series at the Opera House today on our electric board. Well, San Bernardino is in California, and the World Series was being played much farther east, thousands of miles farther east. So how did they do that? The event that came before this was SMPTE was formed, or the Society of Motion Picture Engineers. The television wasn't added until 1950. That was incorporated in Washington, D.C. in 1916. But even before SMPTE, here's that San Bernardino Daily Sun again. This time it's the front page of the sports section, and they're saying the Phillies and the Red Sox will clash in the World Series Friday. This is 1915. Big games to be played on the Sun's electrical diamond at the Opera House. So what is that? But we can go back even farther than that. Here's an article in the New York Times in 1914 from Archibald Montgomery Low, and he says he did a demonstration of television to the Society of Automotive Engineers in London. The reason it was the Society of Automotive Engineers was that he was an automotive engineer, also a rocket engineer. But we can go back farther than that. Here's a publication in the Journal of the Röntgen Society. Röntgen was the guy who discovered X-rays. And here is a diagram of all electronic scanned television. This is the sort of thing everyone used up into the 1980s, published in 1912, and without the diagram, the idea of scanned all electronic television was published in 1908. So the people who say that Philo Farnsworth came up with that idea, he was 1 year old at the time. But we can go back even farther than that. Here is a consumer publication by Hugo Gernsback in 1909, and if you look at the table of contents in the middle there, the first story is about television and the telephote. But we can go back even farther than that. Here's a picture tube in 1907. The patent was applied for then. There's some question about whether the tube itself was actually created as early as 1902. But we can go back even farther than that. Here is the Paris World's Fair in 1900, and at one of the scientific conferences, Konstantin Persky reads a paper on television. It's the first time the word was used. So the word was coined in 1900, and the legendary editor of the Manchester Guardian, Charles Prestwich Scott, said, "Television, the word is half Latin, half Greek. No good can come of it." But we can go back into the 19th century when people used different words for television, the electrician Fernsehens, or the telefotoskopu, or telescopie électrique, all sorts of terms. So here is a television system proposed by a Swiss scientist in 1897, and what's interesting about that is we didn't really know which was going to be large screen in 1897. Would it be television, where it's projected and lots of people can see it, or would it be film, where you look through a viewing thing one person at a time? But even earlier than that, here is a paper in 1894, published again by SMPTE founder Charles Francis Jenkins, about his television system that he was proposing at the time. By the way, he used the same term, phantascope, for both his television system and his film system. But we can go back before that. Here is an engineer who worked at Westinghouse, and this is an article in Scientific American Supplement in 1893. And the cute things here, the television set on the left has a chimney for its light source, and the camera on the right has a camera-mounted light. I think that might be the first diagram in the world for a camera-mounted light, but it's not the first description, as I'll point out in a moment. But we can go back farther than that. Here's 1892, a book that came out, published by this guy, Albert Robida. He did the illustrations as well as the text. And the caption on this image is "Purchases via television." But we can go back farther than that. And here is a press conference that Edison held in Chicago in 1891, and the press were saying, well, what are you going to show at the World's Fair that's coming up? And he essentially says, I'm going to show color television. And the press said, really? And he had a little chuckle, and no one's sure if he was being serious or not. But we can go back farther than that. Here's a quip by Milton Berle. This is not back farther than that, although Milton Berle used to pretend he was the oldest person around. But he said if it weren't for Edison, we'd all be watching television by candlelight. And that sounds very funny, but in fact, here is a diagram of a television system. This was published in 1890. Supposedly the design was done in 1885, and the light source for the television system is an oil lamp. Used a light valve light modulator to control the light that was getting to the eye. This was in Australia, by the way. We can go back a little bit farther than that. This is maybe the earliest description of a camera light. This is from the electrical engineer in 1889, and they're talking about two incandescent lamps on either side of the camera. The incandescent lamps illuminate the face of the person who's using the system. But we can go back even farther than that. And here we are again. This is 1886 in the Atlanta Constitution, and the headline says, "A complete and convenient arrangement to take the game in detail, baseball at the Opera House." What the heck is going on? Let's go back even a little bit farther. This is 1885, the first patent issued for a complete television system, and it was applied for in 1884. But we can go back even a little bit before that. And here is an image from another one of Robita's books. It's an image of war coverage. I call it HDTV because the screen has a 16:9 aspect ratio. The caption says it's the TV news. And here is the reporter. And lots of modern echoes there. The mobile unit is labeled press. The reporter is holding a microphone as well as the camera. He gets wounded, he becomes the story, and there's a really, really, really long cord because radio wasn't around yet. But we can go back farther than that. Here's 1880, a book published about television in French, English, and Portuguese. But we can go back farther than that. And here is an article that appeared in English Mechanic and World of Science, and this was by an ophthalmic and oral surgeon in Dublin. And if you look at the bottom of the left column, he says, "I have succeeded in transmitting built-up images of very simple luminous objects." And then on the right side, he talks about what the frame rate for television should be, 10 per second, and he talks about problems with using selenium and so on. But we can go back farther than that. And here is an image that appeared that the great historian Eric Barnow called a prediction of television. They call it Edison's telephonoscope, which transmits light as well as sound. Was this really a prediction? Here's another image from the same publication. This is Edison's anti-gravitation underclothing. So they weren't really taking this seriously. But Edison did, in fact, make a telephonoscope in 1878. It was a binaural ear trumpet. It had nothing to do with vision. And that's from the patent caveat that he sent in on that. But we can go back farther than that. In 1877, 9 or 10 people started writing about or working on television in multiple countries and languages, and we have the first publication about television that appeared in The Sun in New York on March 30th of 1877. Now, why am I indefinite about 9 or 10 people? Here is the list of the people, and one of them used the pen name electrician, so we don't know if that was one of the other people. But anyway, we started on the right side at the bottom there on the future. We've gone back through 2020, 1939, and so on, all the way back to 1877. And what happened before 1877? Nothing. Zip. Zilch. Not a single prediction of a television system, not in fiction, not in fantasy, nothing whatsoever. It's not exactly true, because St. Clare of Assisi, who lived in the 12th and 13th centuries, one Christmas night when she was ill, she said she heard and saw the Mass at the church across town as if present in person, and as a result, she is the official Catholic Church patron saint of television as of 1958. Now, what we did have was crystal balls and magic mirrors and the like. So here's a story by Sir Walter Scott, My Aunt Margaret's Mirror, and it's about this strange doctor who shows things to people, but he says, I don't know, could be in the future, could be in the past, could be someplace, we don't know where it is. There were these displays, but there were never cameras associated with them. Now, aside from faith and fiction, there were telescopes. So there's a 1608 patent application for a telescope, and the earliest known illustration of a telescope in 1609. And down at the bottom is an 1884 ad for a telescope using a German word that today still means TV set, Fernseher. But still no TV camera. We had telescopes, we had magic mirrors, but no camera. So let's go back to Scotland. And in 1753, somebody named CM, we don't officially know who the CM is, although various people speculate on it, comes up with an expeditious method of conveying intelligence by means of electricity. And he explains how an electrical telegraph would work, and he even explains how to insulate the wires. So there's another great Scot, Alexander Bain, and he developed a printing telegraph, and he developed a remote synchronized clock, and then he put the two of them together to get scanning for image transmission. So he had the idea in 1842. In 1843, he patents it. This is the British patent. The U.S. patent was issued in 1848. Really? He came up with a way of doing image transmission? Yes, really. Here is a system that was built based just on the patent from 1843, and you can see it is faxing a Japanese character from the transmitter to the receiver. He introduced pixels, he introduced scanning lines, frames, line sync, and frame sync. And so he was awarded an Emmy. And the Emmy was awarded in 2016. It went to Kirkintilloch, which is a town in Scotland that has maintained his grave since he died there.
The town in 1877.
Alexander Bain invented the electric clock, and he also invented many improvements in the electric telegraph. He then put these two technologies together and created an early form of fax machine. But it involved image scanning, image transmission along a wire, and then image reassembly. These principles are the foundations of television.
The Emmy has been accepted on his behalf by East Dunbartonshire Council. It looks after his grave in Kirkintilloch.
We're going to have it on display in our local museum. We're also going to advertise it in our other buildings. We hope to have pictures and a bit of the story in other buildings, but also encourage our young people to come along and see it. As you know, we're always trying to get young people interested in the sciences, and I think this is going to be a fascinating story for them, bringing it right up to date by getting the Emmy.
But Bain didn't invent TV. He only invented scanning. So yes, pixels, yes, scanning lines, yes, frames, yes, line sync, yes, frame sync, but no images. But the fax did lead to television, although kind of circuitously. Here's an Italian inventor, Giovanni Caselli, and he came up with an improved version of Bain's fax machine. And this guy, Edmund Becquerel, demonstrated the improved version of Caselli's fax machine to the French Academy of Science. Now, you may be familiar with his name, Edmund Becquerel, or you may be familiar with one of his relatives, but he is the name that's used for the Becquerel Prize for Outstanding Merit in Photovoltaics. Now, why is his name used for that prize? Because he discovered the photovoltaic effect in 1839. So we have this ability to convert something optical to something electrical in 1839, and he demonstrates this fax machine. But he promptly forgot about it, and everybody else forgot about it, so he never mentioned using some sort of photosensitive element with the fax machine. So here is a piece of sheet music that was transmitted in 1860 by Gioacchino Rossini. He's the composer of The Barber of Seville and many other operas, using the pantelegraph. Here is another image that was transmitted by pantelegraph. Now take a good look at this image, and I've blown up the bud so you can see the scanning lines on it, but take a look at what you're seeing here. You see some kind of flowers, but it's just a black and white image, or maybe greenish and white image. But the press tends to go a little overboard sometimes when these things happen. So here is a report on it, and they're saying the inventor telegraphed a painting of a full-blown rose from the observatory to the bureau. The petals were of a beautiful pink color, and the leaves of an equally good green. Wow! Amazing. Also, they say that Rossini telegraphed his music to Marseille. He didn't. It was just to Amiens, but oh well. But commercial fax service began in 1865, and it was often used for signature verification, very important to the banking system at the time. It was sort of the first element of financial technology. So we had all the pieces of television in place, but still no TV idea. The idea of a camera happened in the 5th century BC, and the camera lens was added in 1850. Becquerel came up with optoelectronic conversion in 1839. The idea of electronic communications, CM, in 1753. We have photography, the daguerreotype in 1839. Image scanning from Bain, having a TV set with the glow varying with current for incandescence. That came out in 1802, and the light valve in 1875, but we don't have television because nobody had the idea for it. So meanwhile, back at the telegraph in 1858, the first transatlantic cable went into operation. And this was the first message that was sent on the transatlantic cable. It was from Queen Victoria to President Buchanan, and it's 99 words. It took 16 and a half hours to transmit it. Now, part of that was the people at the receiving station didn't know it was being transmitted, and somebody said, "Oh, I'm hearing some clicking, it must be being transmitted." But part of it was they couldn't really tell what was an appropriate click and what was just static on the line, and so they had to keep asking for retransmission, and it took an awfully long time. Well, the chief engineer of the telegraph company was this guy, Edward Orange Whitehouse. His third name was probably pronounced something like Wildman, but he always styled himself by that name. I prefer to pronounce it Wildman, so this is Wildman Whitehouse. And he got fired by the board of the Atlantic Telegraph Company, which he had joined only in 1856. Now, why was he fired? Well, this transmission took 99 words, 16 and a half hours, so he came up with an idea of how to improve that, and he said, let's put thousands of volts into the cable. That'll help things. And William Thomson, who is later Lord Kelvin, said, maybe that's not such a good idea. Because what Thomson wanted to do was use his mirror galvanometer that was much more sensitive and was used for transatlantic cable telegraphy for a long time, very similar to the dynamic micromirror devices that are used in digital cinema projectors today. But what happened was the cable burned out. But it turns out that it wasn't really the high voltage that burned out the cable. And Lord Thomson came to Whitehouse's defense even before this discovery that the center of the cable was too close to the outer shield, and that's where the arcing occurred. So they had to run another transatlantic cable, and there's one of the ships that laid this cable. Is called the Great Eastern, and this is the guy who designed the ship. I have this in here just because I love to say his name, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was a heck of an engineer. And this guy was another engineer, Willoughby Smith, and he was assigned to monitor the health of the cable. So he's on the ship, and he's got to monitor it the whole time, and we're talking thousands of miles of cable. So even though it's copper and even though the resistance is pretty low, when you have thousands of miles of it, you need a pretty high resistance if you're going to do some kind of a bridge. So he tries doing things with layers of tin foil and gelatin, and that's not stable enough, and somebody says, why don't you try selenium? And so he does, and these are the actual selenium rods that he uses, and the resistance is really good, but during the testing, somebody takes a cover off one of the boxes and everything changes. He puts the cover back on and everything changes again. So he discovers that selenium changes its resistance based on the light that's falling on it. And so he sends a message to the vice president of the Society of Telegraph Engineers, says, could you read this letter at the next meeting? And so the guy reads the letter, and Nature magazine picks up on it, and then somebody else challenges it and is sort of polite, but says, why am I not able to get the same results that he's gotten? And, my failure has not been one of degree, but has been absolute. So I must be doing something wrong here. So a whole bunch of people start doing testing, and they find that, yes, in fact, selenium does change its resistance based on the light that's falling on it. These are all the people, including the guy who wrote that letter in the first place. And one of them is Siemens. Now, there were 4 Siemens brothers. The one in this case is Werner von Siemens, who ran the company in Germany and who was maybe the best scientist. One of his brothers was Charles William Siemens, and he was in Britain, and he was running the Siemens company there, which happened to be involved in undersea cables, so he was the president of the Society of Telegraph Engineers. So he decides to give a talk. Now, sometimes you have a situation where a historian discovers some long-lost document and it changes everything. This is not such a situation. This may be the most publicized thing at the time, and yet you haven't heard of anything about Siemens being involved in television. There's the picture of him. Some of you may know that he came up with a furnace for steel that was very important. He came up with all kinds of other stuff, but nobody knows him as having anything to do with television. But in 1876, he decides to give this talk at the Royal Institution, and it's published in their proceedings, and it's about 11 pages worth of proceedings. And in the next to the last paragraph, he says, I've come up with this little apparatus just to demonstrate. And he shows this thing. It's kind of a sphere that has a cylindrical hole, horizontal hole drilled in it. There's a plate of selenium at one end. There's a lens at the other end. And he says, there's kind of an analogy between its action and the retina of our eye. And then he says this, here we have then an artificial eye which is sensible to light. Now, all this was a light meter, and not even a very good one at that. It got bored, if you will, with the light that was coming on it, and you had to close the shutters and let it recover before you could take another measurement. But no one had ever said anything like that before. An artificial eye which is sensible to light. So, Scientific American writes it up on May 6, 1876. Artificial eyes made sensitive to light. We wish we could tell you that it gives vision to the blind, but we cannot. But perhaps it contains a germ of promise in that direction. And it's not just Scientific American. Maybe every publication in the world. I haven't been able to prove that, but I found so far that it's been in English, French, German, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, and Spanish publications. Obviously, the London Medical Record would say something about the new artificial eye, but here's the Willamette Farmer in Oregon, artificial eyes made sensitive to light. Here's the Great Bend Weekly Tribune in Kansas, truly artificial eye. Here's the Wallaroo Times in South Australia, the Bruce Herald in New Zealand, the Journal of Education for the province of Quebec. They're all talking about this artificial eye. And so, in 1877, we have those television researchers. Remember the list of the 9 or 10 people. Here's Adriano de Paiva in Portuguese, and he talks about William Siemens. Here's Konstantin Senlek in French, and he talks about Monsieur Siemens. Here is Juliana Horowitz in Polish, and he's talking about what Siemens did. And earlier you heard about the Cosmos that your upcoming meetings are. Well, he did this in a publication called Cosmos. And how about George R. Carey, who was the first person to start working on television in 1877? Well, here is one of his notebooks. This is the earliest known mention of an electrical camera. He calls it a selenium electrical camera, January of 1877. He has diagrams of it. It's witnessed by various people. He even came up with a single-line version, so he thought about using scanning with it. And here's his notes, and he said, I had my first idea of a selenium electrical camera in 1876 after reading an article in December 9th, page 374, Scientific American of 1876. So what was the Scientific American article in 1876? There it is. Siemens Sensitive Artificial Eye. It's the second article that Scientific American did about it. And that's what inspired Carey. So that's sort of the end of the story, except the question is, why don't we know anything about Siemens? But there's two tangents that I want to get to before that. One is hoaxes. Another one is home runs, this baseball stuff that I've been talking about. And then history. That's a history book that was published by Jenkins in Washington. So here's a story in the Boston Globe on the left side there, and it's state-lined Washington because Alexander Graham Bell was working in Washington at Volta Laboratories, and a lot of people were claiming that Bell was working on some sort of television system. And he said, no, I have not. The idea of seeing by telephone is 21 years old now, but it's not me. And I didn't do anything, and nobody has done anything that's really working yet. The Washington Star, that's their building there, and you can see thousands of people, but I'll get to that in a moment. So let's continue with the hoaxes. Here are the 1877 people. The first six people, John Kamak and George Carey, Julian Horowitz, Adriano de Paiva, William Sawyer, and Konstantin Senlek, they all did research. Sawyer was maybe a little nuts, but he did some real research. He had one of the first patents on an incandescent light, which Westinghouse bought and used against Edison. Frederick Lou had an idea. That's okay. Louis Figuier was a science reporter, but he reported falsely that Bell was working on television. Then what Electrician wrote was really a hoax, talked about all kinds of crazy things. And then there's this Dr. John F.G. Mittag from South Carolina, and he was talking about how there was some kind of an ether that connected people's eyes, and that's how the images were going to be transmitted. And you can see that he was published in the American Phrenological Journal, which gives you an idea of how much we should rely on him. Now here's a story in American Manufacturer and Iron World, and generally whenever you see a story that says that everything is working perfectly, it's probably a hoax, because even in the 1920s and 1930s people weren't working perfectly. But they're saying that this firm of Connolly Brothers and McTeague, which were patent lawyers, and his partner lives in Washington, D.C., he's been able to reproduce clearly and faithfully in a dark room the images of persons at the other end of the line. Well, I'm not sure where the hoax came from, but I don't think it was those guys, Connolly Brothers and McTeague, because they were genuine inventors and genuine patent attorneys, and here's a genuine patent that they got for an automatic telephone exchange in 1879. Now here's another patent for a telephone exchange. This one issued to Ward Decker. There was also one in the UK for basically a similar thing. What's interesting about this patent is it's the first patent for a system of telephony that talks about it being used for seeing by electricity. So basically what we're doing now, where you're watching me over a switched network, that was patented in 1895, the idea of seeing by electricity with a switched network. Now let's get into this baseball stuff. Well, here's the first baseball game that was televised in the United States. It was in 1939. It was Columbia versus Princeton at Baker Field in New York. And they're saying the players are like flies. The spectators at the screen are unable to follow the action, but the announcer tells the story. So even in 1939, television not necessarily so great. But I showed you all those things where people were watching things and paying to watch baseball games as early as 1884. Well, there were various technologies that were used. The earliest one was little more than a bulletin board with some holes in it. There would be a telegrapher at the game who would telegraph the plays back to a telegrapher at the theater where people were watching. And there would be another person who would run around and put flags into the holes on the bulletin board or something. Then in the middle, they got motion. There are cranks that you can see on the outside of the board, and you could crank the pegs around and they could move at different speeds. Then electricity got added in 1891, and by 1911, here is a crowd watching a ball game in Herald Square in New York, and the crowd is estimated at 70,000 people. The baseball stadium where the game was being played could only hold 55,000 people, and there were so many people that the merchants couldn't do their business, so there was a lawsuit by a merchant saying, hey, I can't sell any jewelry. Well, what were people looking at? Here's a system that was used by the Washington Post. It was called the Rodier Electric baseball game reproducer, which set Atlantic City wild. And here is a video. This was at the Chicago 1919 World Series, the Black Sox World Series, if you will, and you can see the ball moving. This is just a little clip, about 6 seconds, and you can see how people would watch the ball and see what the players were doing and that sort of thing. This was from some film that was found in a garbage heap in Dawson, and because it was so cold up there, it was relatively well preserved. You can see the whole film at the URL there. Here's some more baseball viewing systems that were used into the 1930s. The Chapman automatic baseball system at the upper left was designed for one person to be able to operate. The Noakes Electroscore on the right side had 1,500 light bulbs, and it could actually show the arc of where the ball went. And then the system at the bottom left is Washington again. This is inside the National Theater in Washington. It's called the Coleman Lifelike Scoreboard, and it had 400 projectors and required 7 operators. And one of the projectors was a moving projector, and it could do motion sequences and all kinds of other things. So people would pay to watch ball games this way. And it wasn't just baseball. This is the gridograph for football. So, why is Siemens not in TV history books? Why is this something that you've just heard tonight? And these are 3 of the best television history books around. The History of Television 1880 to 1941 by Al Abramson, and Television and International History of the Formative Years by Russell Burns, and Early Television, a Bibliographic Guide to 1940 by George Shears. And all 3 of these authors are dead. The 3rd book was posthumously published. Well, there was an error that started in 1911, and the person who made the error, Arthur Korn, was a brilliant engineer who was working on fax and photo transmission systems. And so he says Der Erste, the first system, was in the year 1875 with the Amerikaner Carry. Well, that error got picked up over and over and over again. So here's a French history of television in 1928, and it says that Carey did it in 1875. And then Campbell Swinton, the guy who came up with those electrical television systems in 1908 and 1912, he made the same errors in Discovery and the next year in Nature. Garrett and Mumford from the Science Museum, Vladimir Zworykin in the Proceedings of the IRE, Gorokov in the Radiotechnica, Russian publication, and even the SMPTE 60th anniversary publication, 101 Years of Television Technology. The title of the publication was based on Carey being 1875, but they did a very good job. Let me just show you. Here's an letter that Campbell Swinton wrote to Nature, and he says, "How dare you say that Charles Francis Jenkins did anything significant when Carey did all this stuff back in 1875?" But here's that 101 years of television technology, and the first footnote is historians have differed somewhat on the exact year of Carey's proposal, but a number have placed it in 1875, but we couldn't find anything before 1879, which is true. His publications didn't start until 1879. So the next year, George Shears did a paper in the SMPTE Journal on historical notes on television before 1900, and he says it's just a legend that Carey did stuff in 1875. But there was an auction at Swan Galleries, and they auctioned off Carey's notebooks, but the auction took place in 2001. So that's the first time that we were able to actually see his notebook that said he did his first work in 1877 and that it was based on Siemens in 1876. The early television bibliographic guide was published in 1997. Shears died in 1983. Christopher Sterling is from George Washington University. Elliot Sivovich was from the Smithsonian. So great people. If Shears was alive, he probably would have made the connection when the Carey papers were distributed. He does have the Siemens lecture in there, but he doesn't connect that to the work that took place in 1877. So that's about it. Big tip of the hat to Andre Lang of histtv.net. Terrific history of television site. It's in French, but Google Translator or whatever system you use is probably going to do translation. Here are links to an article on the role of Siemens in the proceedings of the IEEE. Here's a link to another one on watching remote baseball games before television. And again, these slides are available at bit.ly/SMPTEDC-7-30, today's date. So at that juncture, I'll be happy to take any questions anyone has.
Although we do have one attendee who wants to change the name of his dog from Farnsworth to Bane.
Good idea. Although Farnsworth was a brilliant engineer. He never claimed to have invented television. He never claimed to have invented scanning. It's the people who tried to make him out to be this sole U.S. inventor who did that kind of thing. He did some brilliant work at ITT. He did work in electron microscopy and other stuff, and he did some absolutely terrific work on electronic television as well. But the idea of scanning was not his.
So we did get a question, and it's far more political, I think. What do you think the future is of TV? And broadcasting, I guess, in particular.
The people that I've shown you here generally were not people who were dealing with transmission. They were dealing with ways of acquiring images and displaying images, and I think that we have a very solid history, a very solid future for that. As far as broadcast, hard to say, but I'd be very sad if it goes away. And when there's a disaster, the first place I turn is broadcast television, because the chances are my cable is going to be cut or my satellite dish is going to be knocked over by the hurricane. So broadcast is pretty important.
It's funny as you say this. I'm hoping we stay on the air with this, but I'm watching this big red cloud coming on the radar over my house and knowing the power might get cut, and I'm feeding this to all of you, so I can relate. Rick, you have any more questions?
Well, we've got one from Phil Whitebloom who wants to know, Mark, how long did it take for you to do all of this research?
It's a difficult question to answer because I started doing it when I was in college in the 1960s. I'm an engineer, and engineers have to answer the question why or why not. And so, to my mind, you can't be an engineer without also being some form of historian, because you need to know what people tried previously and whether it worked or didn't work. And so I was always looking up what people tried previously and started discovering things. The stuff on Julian Ochorovich, for some reason, I seem to be the only person of the current day who discovered that he did work on television in 1877 and 1878. He's pretty famous for other things that he did. He had 2 PhDs. He was a polymath. But even people in Poland that I speak to have never heard of him and didn't know that he had anything to do with television. So I keep learning things all the time.
Eric Utter wants to know, will you publish a book on this topic?
Probably won't do a book on it. I did do the thing on the proceedings. The book that I'm working on pretty slowly is on the intersecting histories of media technology and opera. And you just had a couple of little glimpses in there, like people going to the opera houses to watch remote baseball games. And that first publication about television in 1877, it talked about people going to theaters around the world to watch an opera that was transmitted from another theater. That's my day job. That's being engineer in charge of the Metropolitan Opera Live in HD, where we transmit to cinemas around the world. So the idea of that was first published in 1877. But there's a tremendous number of interconnected moments between opera history and media technology history, and I have done some things for SMPTE and the IEEE on that previously. So if you go to Vimeo, there's a SMPTE thing on how opera helped create the moving image media, and on YouTube you can find an IEEE keynote that I did on how opera helped broadcasting.
Got an interesting question, or a question you could riff on. What inventions or stories do you see in this presentation in 50 years, assuming you're around to give it?
Well, I'd love to see that polysensual cerebrum communicator. Everything takes a long time. Isaac Asimov used to say that if somebody tells you something is impossible, you should not believe him. But if he tells you that it's possible, you should believe him. But it might take longer than your lifetime before the thing that's possible happens. So, Becquerel came up with the optoelectronic conversion in 1839. Einstein explained it in 1905. That, by the way, was what Einstein got the Nobel Prize for, not for the theory of relativity, but for explaining the photoelectric effect. And we finally got to watch television sometime in the 1930s, most of us later than that. So things take time, but I'd sure love to have that cerebrum communicator with multisensual input.
From David Blayak, his question is, did Marconi ever experiment with sending pictures over wireless?
I'm not familiar with anything that he did in that area. It's conceivable. There's some interesting opera connections to Marconi. One of the things that I've been working on recently, there's a local opera company that obviously can't do performances at the moment, so I've been doing opera quizzes for them, and they're putting them up on the internet. And one of them was about the moment that this great opera singer, Nellie Melba, showed up at the Marconi factory in Chelmsford, England, to sing. And part of her agreement was not only that she was getting a fortune for coming over and singing for 20 minutes, but also she had to be picked up at the station in a white Rolls Royce and driven to the factory. And so the people at the factory were in a panic, and they said, we can't have her come into the factory floor. She's too important for that. So there's this wonderful conference room, and let's just move the microphone in there. And so they moved the microphone into the conference room, and they did a test, fortunately, and the probably capacitance of the microphone cable caused a problem, and the microphone exploded, and the cable caught fire, and the carpets burned. So she did, in fact, do her singing from a shack near the factory floor. But I'm not familiar with any visual transmission that Marconi came up with for wires or over the air.
Larry Ferrario asks, is there a biography of the Siemens family you can recommend? It sounds like all the brothers are worth writing about.
Yeah, they are. There's a Siemens historical site. They actually have a historical institute as part of the company, and they were moving for about a year, so the website was down. It might be back up now, but I would recommend that historical site as a start. It's got great stuff on all the brothers. And by the way, if you're ever in London, if you go to East London, there is an Alcatel-Lucent factory. I know Nokia took over Alcatel-Lucent, but they're still keeping this factory called the Alcatel Submarine Cable Division, and it's the place where Willoughby Smith worked, and it's still making submarine cables that are being used today, fiber optic cables for the most part today. But all of the submarine cable companies used to be right around there in East London.
Nicholas Najwa wants to know what you think of ATSC-3 and the transition to be forced on the public.
From an engineering standpoint, I think ATSC-3 is absolutely wonderful. And if only we had it in 1996, we would be in terrific shape today. The political stuff, it's hard for me to say. I'm not a politician, and I'm a terrible predictor of the future. I'm pretty good at predicting the past, but not so good at predicting the future.
John Fleetwood asks, I've never before seen the photo of the burned out transatlantic cable. I actually own a salesman sample of case of the undersea cable from the telegraph and construction of London. Do you have anything to comment on about that?
Yeah, I might have put a date in there when they found that piece. Everyone assumed that when Wildman Whitehouse put the thousands of volts into the cable, that was what destroyed it. But they eventually did some dredging, and they pulled it up, and they found that there was a manufacturing defect. Wasn't that far from shore, but far enough that no one was going to notice it until they dredged up the cable. So I don't remember, a few miles, I think, from the Ireland station was where they found that.
What did they do to splice the cables?
They would dredge them up. They had these grappling hooks, and if the cable broke, which was something that happened pretty frequently, they would drop the grappling hooks down and try very hard to get the end of the cable, and then pull it up, and then do a splice and cover it in some gutta percha, which is kind of a rubbery sort of compound, which is what the people were using at the time, and put some armoring around it and send it back down.
So Gary Eichmeyer asks, will you do a presentation on the color television battle between RCA and CBS? Assuming that he means that perhaps you can talk a bit about it.
Sure. When the first NTSC, which was the one in 1940 that issued its report then, came up with the standard for television in the U.S., the 525 lines and 4:3 image and 6 megahertz channels and everything else that NTSC has, with some very slight differences that occurred later. They were working on color right at the start, and Goldmark at CBS had proposals that he presented to the first NTSC for coming up with color, And the first NTSC was, by the way, one of the greatest collaborations between government and industry that had ever happened. And everyone just kind of put away all of their corporate benefit stuff, and they just said, okay, let's come up with this television standard. And one of the things they were actually concerned about was whether color television was going to harm people's vision, because we have simple lenses in our eyes, single lenses, and a single lens cannot focus on multiple colors in the same plane at the same time. It needs to change focus. Red appears closer than blue appears. Now, if we're looking at a real-world scene, then we're constantly changing the focus of that lens, so it's not a big deal. But if we're looking at a plane, which is a television screen, then there was a big concern about that. So they actually had some ophthalmologists and professors come in, professors of vision, and say, no, this is not going to be an issue. But Goldmark was already pushing the idea of field sequential television, which is what CBS came up with, the idea that first you would capture, say, a red image, and then you would capture, say, a green image, and then you would capture a blue image, and you would just do that fast enough that you wouldn't really see any problem. When it came time for approving a color system, the government went completely differently than they went for the first NTSC. So rather than the FCC saying, okay, you guys convene a committee, we'll provide you whatever resources we can, we'll make this thing happen. Instead, they just said, CBS, your system is going to be approved. And it wasn't just RCA. There was another company called Color Television Inc. that had yet another system, and there were yet other companies, and they're all, what do you mean CBS is going to be approved? And the CBS system at that time, it was field sequential, but because it had to live in the same size channel that the black and white system had, and it theoretically had to provide 3 times more information, they had to reduce the frame rate from 30 per second to 24 per second, and they had to reduce the number of lines per frame, so they did that too. And the result was it was incompatible with black and white TVs. So because they had been lobbying the government said, okay, you need to transmit this now. And CBS would transmit, but every time they transmitted something, nobody at home with a black and white TV could see anything. So there were people who made adapters so your black and white TV would work, or an adapter so you could actually watch color on your black and white TV, and then there were a handful of color sets, but it was really quite a problem. And it turned out that the CBS system was then shut down very quickly. And the reason for the shutdown was the Korean War was just getting started, and one of the government agencies involved in that said, okay, we cannot allow you to make color TV because that technology is needed for the war effort. Color TV wasn't really needed for the war effort, but it was a good excuse for CBS to not transmit field sequential TV anymore. And by that point, everyone was chastised, including the FCC, and so that's when the second NTSC happened. And the second NTSC was also a good industry government organization, and much larger than the first NTSC, and lots of wonderful developments. And RCA was just a contributor to the second NTSC. There were lots of differences between what they came up with and what RCA had come up with originally. And I know that your section is interested in fractional frame rates, and we got fractional frame rates from the second NTSC. There's just one page of one of the committees that talks about why you have to go to a fractional frame rate, but we've been stuck with that ever since.
I'll just add a crass commercial, actually non-commercial, for that webinar that we planned for the fall on fractional frame rates. And you'll be one of the presenters at that, so we're looking forward to it. Could you speak to CCAM and PAL along this conversation? Because obviously those standards didn't exist through most of the history you presented today. But I thought you could enlighten us.
Sure. PAL is really nothing more than improved NTSC. So NTSC was sometimes called never twice the same color because it relied on phase for the tint of the color, whether it was going to be green or red or blue or purple. That was a phase issue, and it was hard to get the phase right, and so early NTSC sets didn't really look that great. So what the Germans came up with, who came up with PAL, was, okay, let's transmit the phase in one direction on one line, one scanning line, and we'll do the phase in the opposite direction on the next scanning line. So if there is a phase change error that occurs, then it's going to affect one line and, let's say, make the red become more purple, and it'll affect the next line and make the red become more green, and so your eye will average that out and you'll see the color correctly. So that's basically the big difference between PAL and NTSC. PAL officially stood for a phase alternation by line, and I'll get to what they called PAL, like never twice the same color for NTSC instead of National Television System Committee, after I do CCAM. CCAM was something completely different. Instead of having a single color subcarrier, there were two color subcarriers, and one had essentially the R-Y component and the other one had the B-Y component, and they were transmitted as FM. And so you didn't really have a need for worrying about phase. And produce nice pictures, but there was this complicated transmission of the two color subcarriers plus the main carrier. But CCAM, which stands for Sequential avec Mémoire, or sequence with memory, because first you had the R-Y component and then you had the B-Y component. You had to combine them in the set. It became known as something essentially contrary to the American method. And it was, in France, it was adopted by Russia kind of as a Cold War thing, like, what can we do that will tick off the Americans? The Russians had been working on their own color systems as well, but it was clear that wasn't going to get there. So France, French territories, parts of the Middle East, and Russia and Russian territories are basically where you found CCAM. And then PAL was called Peace at Last because it was CCAM versus NTSC in the beginning part. There was an interesting government situation in that also. The Americans were clearly trying to get the Russians to go with NTSC, as well as the Brits and everybody else. The BBC actually transmitted a version of NTSC that was designed to work with their system, and RCA was exporting things all over the place, and they wanted to export things to Russia. And there's this government organization called COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Exports or something like that. And they said, no, you're not allowed to export this to Russia, because thinking perhaps of the CBS Korean War stuff, they were saying, no, it's too sensitive a technology and you can't possibly give that to Russia. So because the U.S. wasn't allowed to export it to Russia and the French were, the Russians adopted CCAM.
Scott Fiversh asks, you made some quick mentions of color TV and variable speed recording and playback in the 1920s. Could you expand on that at all?
Sure. There's a great paper that Al Abramson did in the SMPTE journal in think it was 1951, maybe 50. And he did actually two papers. One was called A Brief History of Television Recording, and then the second one was A Brief History of Television Recording Part 2. And he talked about the various recording systems that were used, and some of them were film-based. And one of the earliest uses of the term high definition was a company that was called High Definition Films, and they would actually shoot things on film and then convert it in something very similar to what we do today with a digital intermediate to an electronic version, and then that would be distributed to theaters, and then it would either be video projected or it would be converted back to film for the theater. And there were some major movies that were done this way. One of them was one of the versions of Harlow. There were two Harlow movies that came out in the same year. One was shot on film and one was shot on this high-definition film system. And the other was a Richard Burton movie. I think it was some Shakespeare thing, but I can't remember the name at the moment. But anyway, there were film-based recorders, and so they could be used at variable speed, and the scanning into television could be done at whatever speed things were done. The Baird Phonovision, which was actually recorded on phonograph records, remember this was when television was transmitted by AM radio stations, so everything fit into a 10 kilohertz bandwidth, and it was relatively easy to record it on a phonograph record, but not so easy to synchronize it. So one of the things they did was to bond a phonograph record to a disc that had slots in it, and the slots would extend outside from the phonograph record, and those were used for synchronizing in some of the Phonovision systems. And there were also magnetic recording systems. You saw the Boris Rychulov patent from applied for in Russia in 1922, and that was for magnetic recording of images. So yeah, I highly recommend the Al Abramson papers on that. They're really terrific.
On a similar topic, I guess, as we're talking about other systems, during the early days, you were going to NAB and involved in consumer electronics. If you remember, 1979 or so, two optical disc systems came out in competition, at least two, right? The ones that were laser. I think there was one on a vinyl disc as well, but that might have been RCA to my recollection. But there's a constant angular velocity version and a constant linear velocity flavor. What can you tell us about that?
I actually did write a book about video discs that came out ages and ages ago. But yes, there were many systems. The RCA system was a capacitive electronic disc, so it had grooves like a phonograph record, but the grooves were really just to hold the needle in place, and then there were these sort of troughs in the grooves, and they were an FM signal that could be picked up capacitively based on how far the disc material was from where the capacitive pickup in the needle was. Philips and MCA had similar optical disc systems, but not identical, and they eventually agreed to a single optical disc standard. Constant angular velocity is very simple. You have a motor that goes at whatever speed you want it to go at, 1800 RPM or something like that. Constant linear velocity is a lot trickier. You want the disc rotational speed to change all the time so that the signal speed that's being picked up is constant. Much more difficult mechanically to do. But there are, certain advantages or disadvantages to each. But there were lots of systems. I did an exhibit for the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1975 called The Performing Arts and the Future of Television. And one of the things we had was a flexible disc that was photographic, so it could be reproduced by photographic technology and then played. And we also had a magnetic disc from a company called Arvin, which was actually commercially used for some very short purposes. There were also obviously the Ampex magnetic disc that was used for slow-mo and instant replay and some other versions of that. And some of you may remember the CMX 600, which was one of the first nonlinear editing systems, and it used a computer disk pack and a light pen, so very advanced technology.
John Fleetwood asks, did you ever experience electronal vision in the 1960s using modified TK60s? And if so, do you know what scan rate they were modified to use?
I did not experience it. I've seen photographs, but that's as close as I've gotten.
This is fascinating. Mark, thank you very much. Rick, also thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for sticking around for an hour and a half of this wonderful presentation by Mark. And maybe next time when we do this, we should really have 2 hours devoted. And probably that will be not enough.